So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the 7th edition of the Ask an Expert webinar series, Charting Coexistence, International Insights into Offshore Wind and Fisheries. My name is Claire Kleinecht. I am the Research and Engagement Coordinator with Marine Renewables Canada, and I'm going to be your host today. Our webinar is going to focus on how fisheries and offshore wind may coexist, and we're going to hear about some lessons learned from fisheries engagement in both Maine, USA, and Aberdeen, Scotland. We're going to walk through the early stages and what fisheries engagement looks like in the planning process in Maine, and then we'll walk through how coexistence shapes up at an operational wind farm across the pond in Scotland. So a bit about MRC. We're a national industry organization for tidal, offshore wind, wave, and river current energy. We've been hosting these webinars to inform Canadians about their burning questions relating to offshore wind. Before we get started today, I would like to take a moment to recognize and acknowledge the traditional territories and Indigenous peoples of the different lands in which we're all joining from today. I'm hosting this webinar from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Given that we're coming together to discuss offshore wind, I also invite us all to think about the impacts of renewable energy projects on Indigenous communities and how we can improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures to ensure that marine renewable energy moves forward in an inclusive and respectful manner. A few housekeeping notes before I turn it over to our guest speakers. One, we are recording this webinar. It will be posted to MRC's website and to our YouTube page to check out at a later date, or if you want to share with any colleagues that weren't able to make it today. The bulk of today's webinar will be comprised of 2 presentations, about 20 minutes each, and then followed by a period of questions for both of our presenters. We invite you to ask as many questions as you want. Please feel free to use the Q&A function. You should find it in your toolbar along the bottom of your screen, and we'll do your best to get at as many questions as possible today. Now I'd like to welcome our 2 guest speakers who we're very pleased to have with us today. First, I'm very excited to welcome Hannah McDonald, the Senior Program Manager of the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. Hannah leads GMRI's fisheries engagement and offshore wind strategy, and her work focuses on ensuring coastal and fishing communities have a voice in offshore wind development through transparent, science-based, and locally grounded collaboration. She's led multi-state port visit campaigns, to connect communities with decision makers, created GMRI's offshore wind resource hub, and is working on coexistence on the ground with strategies between fisheries and floating wind farms. Next, we're pleased to welcome Michael Sutherland. He is an expert in fisheries and offshore wind renewable energy. Michael advises on fisheries strategy for offshore wind projects across the UK, including both floating and fixed projects. He played a key role in the Kincardine floating offshore wind farm program, which is the largest operational floating wind project, and it was guiding their fisheries engagement from the planning phase through to operation. Earlier in his career, Michael spent 25 years as the Director of Policy and Operations at the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, where he led a great deal of engagement with the fishing sector and energy, and has some policy experience actually in Atlantic Canada with our history with oil and gas here in the Maritimes. So I would like to thank both Hannah and Michael for being here today. We're going to get started with Hannah. So we'll roll right into it. I'll pass it over to you, Hannah, and then Michael, you just take over following the end of Hannah's presentation. Thank you.
Awesome. Claire, can you give me a thumbs up that you can see the screen? Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Claire, for the warm welcome, and thanks to Marine Renewables Canada for having a Maine contingent be a part of this panel and webinar series. As Claire mentioned, my name is Hannah McDonald. I'm a Senior Program Manager at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, or you might hear me say GMRI throughout the presentation. A little bit more about GMRI. So our mission here is to develop and deliver collaborative solutions to global ocean challenges. We're an independent, nonpartisan marine research institute that really works on supporting the Gulf of Maine ecosystems and the communities that depend on it. Part of our mission is those global ocean challenges, and we see 4 of them really being key to our work: seafood sustainability, healthy ocean ecosystems, climate change, and a thriving blue economy. And as you can imagine, offshore wind represents a thread in all of those challenges. So it's kind of why it's a focus area for our work here at GMRI. So as an independent nonprofit, we have to think pretty carefully about our approach and role in the offshore wind space. So our approach is that to ensure that floating offshore wind can be a true collaborative climate solution, it needs to be both community-centered and science-based. So my work is more on the community-centered side of it, which you'll hear about throughout this presentation. Our research team is also developing a lot of knowledge for the Maine research array, conducting the baseline monitoring work there. And then our ocean data's team is also bringing existing data from the offshore wind farms in southern New England into more publicly accessible formats as well. So really thinking about it as an organization in a pretty holistic sense. I want to emphasize that I see our role as being a real bridging institution to make things community-centered. We have a trusted relationship with fishing stakeholders that's been built over the last 2 decades. We've done a lot of work with fisheries management and integrating fisheries knowledge into management processes, as well as doing a lot of collaborative research directly with the fishing industry, helping them build new gear to not harvest species that they might not want to. And it's really built a lot of trust. So when offshore wind was coming to the Gulf of Maine, the fishing industry came to us to help them understand what was going on and how to have them be engaged in the process. I want to give you a little bit of a background on why offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. So New England at large, that's the New England states, Northeast states, have target goal of net zero emissions by 2050, and that's not possible to reach that goal without offshore wind. So one of the key reasons. If you see a map of the windiest areas in the country, the Gulf of Maine is also one of those areas as well. So we have a really strong wind resource to use for wind energy. It also complements hydro and solar, which are other clean energy projects that are happening in New England. Unique to Maine, the University of Maine has the Volturnus floating offshore wind design that you'll see in the photo on the slide. And so for the state, it really exemplifies local innovation from a home institution. And lastly, as I'm sure Michael can allude to a little bit, offshore wind can generate thousands of jobs, and that's always something that the region is looking for. To also give you some context of what are we talking about for the Gulf of Maine, the Gulf of Maine is very deep, too deep for fixed turbines like we have in southern New England. Similar depth to offshore Nova Scotia, where there are also proposed floating offshore wind areas. So here's a diagram of the different types of floating offshore wind. I won't necessarily get too in detail with this. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. But there's been no design that's set for the Gulf of Maine. The Volturnus turbine that the university is creating is a semi-submersible, but there are other options that exist. And I'm also pointing out that floating offshore wind is very different from fixed offshore wind, as it takes a bigger spatial area. You'll see that these are the different types of mooring technologies that exist. Also, none of them have been determined for the Gulf of Maine yet, but there are options, each having pros and cons and each taking up different amounts of space. To kind of answer the who and the where, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is the offshore energy regulator for the United States, or BOEM. And I'm going to kind of walk you through our planning process that started in 2022 for the Gulf of Maine. And through this, I'll talk about the places where there was fisheries engagement as well. And so you'll watch the map get smaller. The green area is the request for interest. So this is where they started. They defined what they called the Gulf of Maine as this green area, and we're really interested from comments from any stakeholder group, developers, fishermen, coastal community member, state agencies on where in this area do we want to have offshore wind. You'll see that it gets further winnowed down in 2023 after that period of stakeholder engagement. They removed it from the coastline. You'll see that they also removed Cash's Ledge, which is a closure area right in the middle of that green area. From there, it went to the final call area. You'll see it's still 9 million acres. They had public comment again, and that time it really drastically shrunk the wind energy areas. Throughout these public comment periods, a lot of my role was to translate what BOEM was looking for. BOEM would often pose questions like interested in knowing where you're fishing and needing as much specific information or detail as you could provide, which isn't something that a fisherman is often very keen on sharing. And so working really closely with the fishing industry, teaching them how to use the Federal Register, which is where you can submit a public comment, notifying them about where the public meetings were, and kind of synthesizing the language that BOEM was using into language that they're familiar with, whether that have been through the fisheries management process or just their understanding of marine space, really trying to bridge those two to communicate better. Here you'll see the draft wind energy areas. This was a near final map. We had seen it winnowed away a lot, a couple wins for the fishing industry. In the map on the left of the screen was that the lobster management area 1, which is where most of the state of Maine does their lobster fishing, was removed completely. This also reduced some of the line of sight concerns as well, as it was far enough offshore where the turbines weren't going to be as visible. So that was a double win for the fishing industry. Some other areas that are highly known for being prosperous fishing grounds were removed as well. So you could really see that the input was working. Between the draft wind energy areas and the final wind energy areas, the Gulf of Maine Research Institute worked hand in hand with BOEM to really provide a more unique type of engagement and public comment period. The past engagements, where you'll see the little yellow or orange arrows here, were often held in large town hall public meeting style meetings. They were also held on Zoom specific to the different gear types. So fishermen had the ability to comment in person or on Zoom, very specific to their gear type as well. So they had those opportunities there, but BOEM felt that there was a need for more intimate conversations, and they had been hearing that in the public comments from the other two periods, that they weren't meeting the fishermen where they were. They were often having to not fish for a day to attend a Zoom, or the timing wasn't right. So BOEM decided to do port visits up and down the coast and worked with us to connect them directly to fishing community members. We had 15 port locations, 300 public comments were submitted during this time, and we met with over 180 stakeholders. And a real success of this work, you'll see the photo on the left, that's from a fisherman's kitchen table, where he invited some other neighbor fishermen of his inside to meet with BOEM. So much smaller focused meetings, looking at maps, pointing out where they're fishing, really effective. And you'll see that if I go back here, the area really dwindled during this period. And finally, there was a lease sale. The proposed sale notice, the lease areas were identified. There were 8 in the Gulf of Maine. And then at the end of October of last year, 2024, we had a lease sale where 2 developers were selected, and that's Avangrid and Invenergy. And the yellow you'll see on here is also the Maine research lease, research array. To be fully transparent and update you on the process now, not much has changed since the leases have been offered up to Invenergy and Avangrid, as well as the state. The federal landscape here is really making it hard for any of the permits to go through to continue to develop these areas at the time. So we have the lease areas in the Gulf of Maine, and I think part of my job moving forward is to help ensure that the time that we're kind of slower to move in the US, we can work with the fishing industry so that when things do happen again in the offshore wind space, that the developers are equipped with the best information from the fishing industry to help inform construction and operation. And I'll get to that at the end of my presentation. So other work that we do at GMRI is engagement to inform specifically what we're working with the fishing industry on. And we have a model of work. We have 6 strategic advisors who all represent different sectors of the fishing industry. Some are a community leader in a significant fishing community. Others are heads of fishing associations. And so we cover everything from large vessels, small vessels in Cape Cod, small vessels in Maine, lobster, ground fish. We try to really have a holistic sense of the different subgroups of fishing community in the region. And these 6 people work with us to help identify what the community needs. Like, what are they stuck on? What's confusing? What's a pressing concern that they have right now? And how can GMRI get them the information that they need? This includes developing resources, which we share on our resource hub to everybody, facilitating meetings and convenings to make sure they can talk to the right experts, and sharing opportunities where there's other public comment opportunity or research prioritization opportunities within the region as well, so that the fishermen can continue to have a role moving forward. I'll quickly share this. This was for the last calendar year, the areas that were most concerned, the fishermen were most concerned about: technologies, cabling, developing, whales, what's the status of existing projects, a lot of confusion on the development process, what is community benefit agreements, and thinking about the economic viability as well. So we've been working on developing resources that create the best available information about those topics and sharing those with the fishing community. So there'll be a QR code at the end of my presentation if you want to scan it and see what we've shared so far. But the audience is really tailored for the fishing industry to have the information they need to have constructive conversations about offshore wind. And another type of engagement that we do at GMRI is engagement to inform future research. And I'll talk about a project that wrapped up this past spring that I also shared at the Marine Renewables Canada conference last fall. So if you were there, this is a kind of a summary of that. GMRI led the stakeholder engagement for a coexistence and floating offshore wind project that was funded by the state of Maine. We did engagement in 3 phases, having the fishing industry define what offshore wind was, what's their initial understanding of it, what are they curious about, and how do you define what coexistence really means. In the second phase, we had them evaluate the different types of floating offshore wind designs, both the platforms and the mooring configurations. And then we drafted recommendations as well and had them provide feedback on that. So recommendations on how fisheries could coexist with offshore wind, getting their feedback one last time to really help the state understand what was truly could be feasible for coexistence and what we still need to learn. One of the things that came out of this work was this compatibility assessment that takes the different types of fishing gears that are used in the Gulf of Maine and compares it to the different types of mooring structures that would be in the water. The full report, which I can share in the chat, has a broader description of what's in this chart, but broadly speaking, you'll see a lot of red and yellow. Red meaning not compatible at all. Dredges, for example, they dig into the bottom and you could dig up a cable. So pretty dangerous. Bottom trawls as well, with the different types of mooring structures. There's a lot of risk for getting hung up. And then for the others, there's certain circumstances in which it could be possible. Tension leg platform operates very similar to a fixed turbine with limited spatial area taken up. And so that's likely to be expected to be technically compatible. We did get the fishermen's input on this. There was a lot of different concerns and a lot of different feedback per gear type on this. So it's not to say that this is exactly right, but it's a step in the right direction and pretty new research that accounts from both the engineer's perspective and the fisherman's perspective. So key findings from this work, both taking in the engineering and consulting firms' research, as well as our stakeholder engagement. Coexistence really depends on gear compatibility, the mooring types, and the project design. There's a potential to have more coexistence if you're doing microsighting, layout optimization, a lot of feedback about the need to bury cables, and then having the technologies so that fishermen can know where those moorings might be or the anchors might be. So kind of like being able to see it virtually on their navigation display. And then other things that were suggested was regional compensation protocols. So the fishermen were often considered being financially compensated as a strategy to coexistence for this fishing space that they might lose. And so thinking about that as at a regional level and thinking about adapting the management of that as needed throughout the project period. And lastly, this is the future work part, the engagement informing future work. There's additional research and modeling needed to better understand gear compatibility with floating offshore wind. So pilot projects were recommended, and that's something that GMRI is now working on with two different funders. We have funding from Responsible Offshore Science Alliance, or ROSA, and Massachusetts Clean Energy Center to explore and really better understand the feasibility of fishing and navigating within floating offshore wind arrays. So this is taking a really virtual, simulated, experiential learning component to it. No, not just talking to the fishermen, but the photo on the left is me in a virtual wheelhouse. You enter a room and it looks like you're entering a vessel. Here are some other photos of that as well. You'll notice in the photo on the left, there's a wind turbine right there as well. So this is all in partnership with the U.S. Maritime Resource Center. They use this facility, the state-of-the-art facility, to train Coast Guard, to train vessel pilots in navigating really complex ports. But they also have run a simulator for Ørsted for fishing and navigating within the fixed turbines. So we reached out to them, and we will be developing floating offshore wind structures for the different types, the different mooring configurations, and further building out their fishing module so that the fishermen that we invite down to these workshops can practice fishing with their gear type. They'll be able to see it in a drone view, as well as if there was an ROV under the water to see if they're snagging anything, feeling safe with navigation. There's different weather patterns that we can put in there. And so really trying to give a true experiential experience without having to risk losing gear or damaging any offshore wind technology in a virtual environment. We'll also be trying to do iterative processes with the workshops, and anything that if we get a snag or something like that, or the spacing feels too tight, is there spacing configurations, layout designs that we can test in a virtual environment that might help inform decision-making in the future. So broadly, lessons learned and best practices among engaging with the fishing industry regarding offshore wind. It's really important to build trust and start those relationships early. I'm fortunate enough to work for an organization that has 2 decades of experience and trust built with the fishing industry, but it's never too soon to start. We had developers in the Gulf of Maine before they had leases trying to meet with fishermen, and so I think that's a good sign that they're really trying to build trustworthy relationships. It's important to engage routinely and not really just when you need something, and I feel like that's something that we try to employ with the resource hub, trying to give them information throughout the entire process. Meeting people where they are, I think that 15 port visit public comment period that we facilitated was really important. It was meeting them at their docks, in their kitchens, town halls, meeting them at existing meetings, trying to not overburden them with another large scale meeting that they would need to find the time to attend. And I think another role that GMRI played was really making the content accessible for everyone. BOEM's bureaucratic language and that they need to share on the Federal Register can sometimes be really difficult to understand, even for myself. And so having the ability to synthesize that and still not lose its significance is really important. And then I think I've really felt the most success in working through trusted channels. That our 6 strategic advisors that help guide our work are really the door into fishing communities. They have their own expertise, but are also always connecting us with the ones who are actually on the water. And so partnering with those local organizations and community groups is really important. And lastly, I'll leave you with this for a second before I turn it over to Michael. I can share the link in the chat as well. This is the QR code for our resource hub, and feel free to send me an email with any questions you might have as well. But otherwise, I'll pass it over to you, Michael.
Michael, go ahead.
Turning technology there. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to present, pass on, and that's all we want to do, a little bit of the experience across this side of the pond in our dealings between fisheries and offshore renewables. I'm supported by Lysandra, who will take us through the presentation. Lysandra comes from a Brazilian background. She came over to the UK to do an oceanography degree, and she's been supporting myself and other colleagues on various endeavours. I think, as Claire said earlier on, my background is I am now a kind of consultant, as it were, supporting a number of offshore renewables developers and other types of folk. I come from a fishing family. My grandfather was one of 13 fishermen. I'm probably the last connection with the industry. I spent 26 years as lead at the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, which is the national body which represents the industry overall here in the UK. And my main role within that was being a liaison guy. We had and have a massive oil and gas industry over here. We've obviously got a very large and significant and traditional fishing industry. And a lot of the lessons that we've brought over to renewables were kind of learnt in our dealings with the oil and gas folk. Lysandra, if you can go to the next slide. Thanks.
Yep.
So in Scotland, we speak for Scotland, we've got a very large and significant fishing fleet. It's a mixed fishery. It's a mixture of whitefish and pelagic and shellfish vessels, large and small, medium-sized, a mixture of nearshore, we call it creeling, potting, and some very large vessels that are capable of fishing very many hundreds of miles offshore. Mainly the vessels tend to be around 70 feet in length on average. Fleet is fairly modern on the East Coast, less so on the West Coast. It's a family dominated industry. So families invest in vessels and they often crew them themselves. So it's an industry that is, I think, still fairly vibrant despite all the challenges of fisheries in the modern world. So just quickly, in Scotland, we have experience of offshore wind farms from 25, 30 years ago, really nearshore, estuarine fixed turbines. However, in recent years, there's been a push from the UK and from the Scottish governments to encourage renewables, and therefore there's a push towards licensing areas offshore for wind farms. These licenses are issued to developers, and they've got to go through various iterations and milestones to be successful in having their development get into construction and production. The concept of floating, which we've already touched upon, is quite important, and I have a specific background on the Kincardine, roll your R's, project, which is the largest floating offshore wind farm in the world. It comprises of 5 floaters. It was originally going to be 11. But in essence, floating gets you into deeper and deeper water, and that is the idea that's behind driving floating. Near shore, shallow water areas up to about 20, 30 meters tend to be fixed turbines. So in terms of, if you can go to the next one, Lysandra. Yeah, just go through that. The next one after that. Thank you. So we've just had the tall ships in Aberdeen. They left yesterday. An incredible 4 days of spectacle. And on the left-hand side there, you see the type of fishing vessel my grandfather went to sea on, a sailing boat, lugger. Even more excitement over here in that President Trump is arriving in Aberdeen in the next day or two to visit his golf course here. You go to the next one, Lysandra. So there's some typical fishing vessels. A lot of our fleet is twin rig trawling, towing 2 nets with a large clump weight in the bottom. Bottom right is a typical trawler, modern trawler, and then that's typical creels or pots. Next one, Lysandra. That's some photographs of the Kincardine on the right and the offshore wind farm just off of here in Aberdeen, with President Trump's golf course just to the right of one of those vessels there. So the theme is coexistence. And I think over here, we've learned from a fishing industry perspective and other industries' perspective is the only way forward is to try and live together and coexist and cooperate. And how you define coexistence is a kind of academic kind of scenario. So from a fishing point of view, the starting point, I think, in the UK was there were marine bills in Scotland and the UK developed about 15 to 20 years ago, aimed at addressing the emergence of renewables. And one of the big strong things is, and I was still at the Fishermen's Federation, is that the fishermen were heavily involved in the framing and the drafting of that legislation. And therefore that set the tone for what was to follow, procedures and types of engagement. UK approach to life tends to be, they set legislation, but it tends to be applied with quite a light touch. It's not overly prescriptive. There's a lot of emphasis on developers self-regulating themselves, and the government departments almost act as referees. The fishermen, both at the UK and the Scottish level, are given high standing. The fishing lobby is quite strong still, despite being a smallish and marginal industry. It politically can kick a punch above its weight, and that's important in terms of addressing these sorts of challenges. The other thing I would stress is that I was a member of a federation, and dealing with developers with one common unified voice from the fishing industry is the best way forward. Being the fishing industry, that's very difficult to achieve unity, but it does help if the industry can be clear with one voice and clear what messages it's projecting. The other point, and kind of Hannah touched upon it at the end of her presentation, is developers and fishermen need to engage. There's no point pretending it's not going to happen, ignoring it. Don't ignore it. You've got to get your jackets off, sit down, fishing industry put their case. The earlier you're in there making your points, the easier it is to shape certain events. The kind of industry over here feels a challenge. Certainly, we've got a huge amount of offshore oil and gas. We've now got a huge amount of renewables challenging us. So it would be remiss of me not to say that it is all straightforward. However, the fishing industry's attitude is we're trying to deal with it. A few kind of lessons learned. One of the main things is somebody like me, I'm embedded deeply in a project as a fishing liaison officer, if you want to put it like that. And that is a legislative requirement that to obtain a license, a developer must appoint a fishing liaison guy. Lysandra, can you go on to the next one before I forget? Quickly in Kincardine, so there's Aberdeen there, and we've got these floaters to the southeast of Aberdeen. Originally going to be 8, scaled it down to 5. So what we did, and I use this as an example, I was straight aboard right at the beginning of the project, and I was able to influence the microsighting of the floaters themselves. We've got 2 arrays, but they're straddled either side of a World War II wreck, which the trawlers I knew wouldn't go down, and we've been able to co-locate the floaters in the least impactful area. We're also in quite hard bottom that is not as heavily fished as immediately adjacent areas there. And that was important that I had that input and I had the influence to, make the point. And that's another important point, is that within projects, somebody like the fishing liaison guy has got to have status. He's got to be knowing what he's talking about. He's got to be credible to the company, and obviously credible to the fishing industry. A few things that helped us within the legislation, we framed a number of national guidelines that developers worked as an envelope, fishing liaison offshore wind guidelines, and that set a kind of standard and expectation of what a developer was required to do. Lysandra, can you go into the next one? So that's just a rehash of, we've got a mix of creel, static gear, and all sorts of other fisheries. Next one, Lysandra. Trawling, midwater, on the bottom, fairly standard stuff. Demersal. We have a huge amount of scalloping as well, big scalloping vessels with scalloping gear, heavy metal, as we call it over here. Next one, Lysandra. So here's an example of a survey that we recently did for a cable route for a new wind farm. And we did the obvious things like engaging strongly with the fishermen to try and do it at the right time of year that was least impactful. We engaged with them, the guys that we need to remove temporarily fishing gear, and we entered into agreements with them. We call them cooperation agreements, because we're looking for cooperation and support mutually, not just compensation. Next one, Lysandra. It comes back to the kind of beginning, why do we need to do all of this? Because there's a hugely vibrant fishing industry, and there's a new industry who wants to go out there and do things. Next one, Lysandra. Mitigation strategies. Well, one of the main things is appointment of somebody like myself, status. We then write a fisheries engagement plan, setting out the architecture of how we'll go about doing stuff, the strategies, and that's a live plan. We keep it live, and it's got high visibility within the developers and indeed the fishing community. That's quite important because it helps engineers and folk within the developers that don't really understand what fishing and such like is about. The flow guidelines I've mentioned. So coexistence, as I said, Hannah touched upon it, early and meaningful engagement. You've got to be trusted. You've got to be transparent. Not everything goes perfectly well. I've learned that you just share the successes as well as you share things that didn't go so well. There is no point hiding anything. One thing about the fishing industry, they know about everything before you do. When we enter cooperation payments here, we do not do that for mobile gear, but we do it for static gear, and we have a methodology that guys and girls got to present us with a certain amount of backing information, support, where their gear is, proof, times of year, and things of that nature. Next one, Lysandra. Oh, that's the end. The couple of other things on coexistence. Again, Hannah touched upon it. I note it from both sides of the table. The renewables, as did the oil and gas industry, brought a huge amount of wealth to this part of Scotland that I'm in. Aberdeen was a fishing port. The fishing kind of collapsed after the Cod Wars, and a lot of the fishing vessels then redeployed to be standby vessels and platforms and things of that nature. And that maintained a lot of employment, and it also helped keep some of the fishing vessels themselves going, because they could switch back and forth between different things. And a similar thing is happening with renewables. It's beginning to bring in a lot of jobs in the ports, around the villages, bits and pieces of things, fishermen that maybe are still creelmen, but they maybe man crewing vessels or catamarans, service cats, and all of that sort of nature. So in Aberdeen, we went from fishing to oil, with still a bit of fishing, and we're now kind of transiting away from oil to this renewables, with still a significant fishing industry around about us. So it definitely has brought in opportunities and helped support the communities and the challenges that the fishing industry shares, no matter where it is in the world. And it's helped retain youth, it's helped develop businesses, and indeed we're beginning to export some of that expertise to different parts of the world. A couple of other small things. We do a lot on awareness. Our floaters have obviously got anchors. We put electronic chart overlays, make sure it goes to the fleet. We keep them up to date on what we're doing activity-wise. We make sure that the lighting and the marking, critical, remain up to date, and that the fishermen are fully aware of these sorts of things. We did simple things like from the fishermen adapting stuff. They wanted marker buoys to mark where the end of the anchors were, and then they decided that was a bit of hassle, so we went with them and we removed them. We adjusted our strategy. Again, as Hannah says, the way that we engage is just not lip service. It's not just a one-off, it's constant. I was down the harbour this morning, been in Aberdeen all week. We've used a number of the fishing vessels to do trips out to see the tall ships leaving, and I engage with these guys almost 24/7. They like phoning you at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night before they go to sea. So it's just not rocking up when you really need something. You're there to kind of support them and be aware of their challenges. So I think there's a lot of work going in to try and build relationships, maintain relationships. It's not perfect by any manner of means. The challenges are there, but I think somehow we've found a way to coexist. So I don't know if that's some use to you, but thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you, Hannah, as well, for your presentation. Those were both great. Now we're opening the floor up to some questions. Please feel free to put any questions that you have into the Q&A box that you'll see along your bottom bar. We have a few in there right now. The first of which is for Hannah. Hannah, given the current administration shifting its stance on climate and energy policy, how does GMRI view the future trajectory of marine renewables like floating wind? And are there key strategies that you see in maintaining this momentum that you've built despite the political changes?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. And thank you, Luke, for the question. It's one that I'm getting a lot lately. So yeah, the shifting stance on energy policy in the US is really shifting the offshore wind landscape and creating a lot more uncertainty. Interestingly, the region, Maine specifically, has seen floating offshore wind projects come and go for over a decade. Stat Oil being an example um, of a project that even had community benefit agreements in place, but then didn't end up happening in the state. So we've seen a lot of back and forth. I think having the lease areas in hand and the developers have those is a really significant step and a telling sign that it will happen at some point in the future. And so our real like strategy for keeping momentum on this is really trying to focus on what are those key questions that we can help address that the fishing industry or coastal communities have now that prepare us for when floating offshore wind does happen, to really have the information in hand now. And in addition to the coexistence work, our economics lab is doing a socioeconomic impact assessment for the offshore wind area. So we're still having work like that done. And with both the coexistence project and the socioeconomic impact assessment being done before this administration leaves, hopefully those are studies that can be leaned on as more specific decisions are being made moving forward.
Great. Thanks, Hannah. I think something that I've been hearing a lot, at least here in regard to the regional assessment in Nova Scotia, is that there wasn't enough time. So maybe there's a bit of a benefit that can be found in having a bit more time to dig into those details now. Great. I see Andy has their hand up. I'm not too sure if we can have participants turn their mic on. Andy, do you mind writing your question into the chat box if that's okay with you? In the meantime, I have a quick question for Michael. Michael, when these wind farms that you've seen be actually developed and gone into the operational phase, you talked a bit about the differences in fishing gear types and some of the exclusions. What advice do you have when it comes to adaptive management with these areas, and how have you seen them change or fishing behaviors change with regard to offshore wind sites?
Yeah, I think a starting point would be that the industry was influential in the kind of managing where some of the areas to be developed were, so that was perhaps in the less face of a really important fishing zone. Then within that, for example, a number of developments I've been involved in, again, in the engagement process, a number of fixed wind farms. I can think an example in the Moray Firth, just north of myself, where there's about 70 fixed turbines. We developed it using lanes where we knew that the toes of the fishing vessels would be, so we made those extra large spacing, and then as we went through the various phases, we adapted, what we saw as where the fishing patterns were, and kind of slightly relocated where we would put some of the turbines. We were able to do that, and that was fairly important as well. We also did a lot of like what you would call like fishing trials to see how vessels would get on with their gear within these turbine areas and what the impacts would or wouldn't be. It's important, I understand that over here, what you've got is a 50-meter exclusion zone around every individual turbine. That's an IMO international sort of requirement, and it's the same with the floaters. My floaters at Kincardine have 50-meter exclusion zone only, but obviously we've got anchors and an anchor spread, and that is sort of laid earlier on, strongly comes down to awareness. The other adaptation I think a number of developers have done is we had some difficult challenges with cable burial. And there was a lot of kind of lessons learned as to what would work and what wouldn't, and particularly kind of being more careful in avoiding the hard bottom areas where gravel placement was required, which is costly and which the fishermen didn't like. But we also at the same time discovered that some of the nearshore areas that were starting to form a new habitat, and the fishermen were attracted to the cable areas, not distracted from it, and therefore we had to adapt our strategy to make sure that the fishermen were fully aware of exactly where the cables were and what the condition of them were, and so on and so forth. So that's the sort of things we've done.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing those examples. That was great. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. I think maybe Hannah and Michael might both be able to answer this question. But Andy asked about long line pelagic fisheries, which are a quite common method here in Nova Scotia. Is there any awareness, Hannah, you pointed to that risk grid on how they interact with floating windmills or fixed wind turbines, and with that fishing gear type especially. Michael, I don't know if there's any examples of what that has looked like in Scotland.
Yeah, I'll let Hannah go first.
Yeah, I can say that long lining was not considered technically not compatible, but it was also not seen as technically compatible. So I think that if it was set within a certain distance from where the anchors are, away from the mooring lines, that it could technically be feasible. It's one of the technologies that we will trial in our virtual simulation to see with like drift patterns and things like that. Is it easy to is it safe to deploy, safe to retrieve, and making sure that while it's set, it's not interfering with the offshore wind technologies too.
Over this side, we don't have a huge amount of long line pelagic fishing. We do have quite a lot of long line whitefish fishing. We call it the ripper. The guys work hooks. And I've found that we get a lot of that near shore as well, where some of the wind farms are, and they seem to have got on okay. One of my big worries was the pelagic guys. We've got a significant pelagic fleet, about 27 pelagic vessels, the kind of royalty of the industry. These vessels are 200 meters in size, fish, herring, mackerel, blue whiting. And these guys work huge nets. I think it's kind of folk know, with trawling and sand netting type nets. The nets are like 8 football pitches wide, as it were, and very, very costly. They're fishing shoals of pelagic, and we put a lot of careful effort into being aware where the really hot pelagic fishing areas were, and making sure that mitigations of avoiding those areas and making sure that the pelagic guys in particular were absolutely aware of what was on the seabed and where it was, and that's been quite important here.
Great, thank you both. Unfortunately, I fear we are out of time, but I appreciate everybody for submitting their questions. We had a great discussion today. I would like to thank especially Hannah and Michael for joining us. It's been very informative and it's been a great discussion. If anybody is interested in more offshore wind related webinars, please check out our website. On the events tab, you'll see the Ask an Expert Offshore Wind show up in the menu there, and you can click the link to any topic that we've covered in the past if you're so interested. I'm also going to plug our conference. Our annual Marine Renewables Canada conference will be held in Halifax this fall from November 12th to 14th, and registration is open for that if any folks are interested in joining us then. We hope to have another webinar as well later this fall, so maybe we will see you sometime soon. Once again, thanks everyone for joining us, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your summers. Bye for now. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.